I will be reading prose tonight, and I know we promised Ocean a poetry reading, so wherever he is. Oh, okay, well then he doesn't have to know. No one tell him, okay? My apologies, it's quite embarrassing. So, yes, I'm from the prairies, and I'm also of Bermudian descent, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I do come from all over, and so it's always a very long explanation. I kind of tend to call myself a mutt. And it's funny, being so young and included in this is very interesting, because I feel like my experience is maybe a little different from a lot of the other the authors included. For one thing, I think a lot of people grew up with a sense of shame being mixed race. It's kind of a dirty secret. Because I feel like I come kind of from a generation of mixed race women who you can't get to shut up about it. Because you feel the need to explain yourself. You feel in a world where, in many ways, not always, but in many ways we have it easy. We feel the need to be a part of a struggle and feel part of a history, and I think part of that is writing. My piece is called The Drinking Gourd, 3 tales. I'll only be reading 1 tale. I had to kind of edit for language, so I'll just be reading the first part, which is called Rufus. Oh, and for the record, I felt a little bad actually listening to Andrea because I suddenly realized, I didn't say anything about hair in my piece. Everyone needs to talk about hair, it's very important. So I just thought I'd insert, for the record, I use a shampoo, conditioner, and deep conditioner specifically for mixed race women called Mixed Chicks. You have to order it from the States. Without further ado,
Thanks for sharing.
you're welcome. And part 1, Rufus, opens with a quote from the spiritual Drinking Gourd. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. My journey could begin in several places. It could begin with the 1910 exodus of between 1,000 and 2,000 blacks who escaped the Jim Crow South by emigrating to the Canaan land, heaven, also known as Canada. It could begin 48 years before, with 6-year-old Rufus, my great-great-grandfather, being kidnapped along with his 2 brothers from their Arkansas home and taken to Texas as by slave traders. The story goes back farther still than that, but I suppose the real beginning and ending is with me, 9 or 10 years old, and my grade 5 class's First Nations study project. At the end of the unit on First Nations art and culture, we were asked to write our own First Nations legends. I wrote about how the night sky is a beautiful woman who wears a cloak of many colors when she goes out walking, and how it shifts in purple and orange and becomes the northern lights. I love the sky stories best because they belong to everyone. You don't see much of the northern lights in Alberta, I'll grant you, but everyone in the world looks at the stars. In those days, I was beginning to consider myself something of an aficionado of world mythology. I think I lived more deeply searching the sky for the story maps laid out there than I did on Earth. Our next assignment was to share a legend that came from our parents. My parents both grew up in Bowness, a district of Calgary nestled against the Bow River that used to be its own town. Now there are so many suburbs, stacked like shingles way out in the foothills, Bowness is almost considered a city center. But in my parents' minds, it's still dusty and rural, with the river valley and train tracks for its playground. My father's stories all began the same way. I grew up in a gray house with a blue roof, and I had 3 brothers, Nick, Liv, and Ben, and we had 3 pets. Sirius the dog, who was black as night, Nosy the bunny, who was white as snow, and Smokey the cat, who was gray as a puff of smoke. The stories were word perfect, each time, and soothing as a litany. My mother's stories were a little different. They tended to be longer than they at first appeared, because time and an interweaving cast of characters attached themselves to one another. You pulled one end of the scarf from my mother's pocket, and out came yards and yards of story. She was the 3rd oldest child in the family, but the oldest girl, which meant the de facto caregiver and second in command to her mother, my Nana. She is also the primary storyteller. It was my mother who first instilled in me the knowledge that I was half black, and that my ancestors had emigrated from the States in 1910 to found communities in the last best West, the prairies of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. I knew I was half black years before I was even aware of differences in skin color. My mother, never one to miss an opportunity to tell stories, is the preeminent historian of Alberta's black pioneer community. My knowledge of the 1910 Exodus goes back further than I can remember. I also knew my father's parents were German and Franco-Italian. It didn't seem all that complicated growing up. My maternal cousins, most of them half black as well, varied in color from darkish white, a phrase I coined to describe my own shade at around the age of 3, to the creamy coffee brown of my mother, aunt, and uncles. The concept proved difficult to translate to others. When I was a little girl, my best friend overheard one of her parents refer to me as half black, and for the record, that little girl is actually Anthony, who's sitting right there. Sorry to out you. She spent the next several months wondering which half of me they were referring to. When no one was looking, she would examine my arms, legs, neck, and face for some sign of my blackness. She eventually gave up looking and assumed that it was the part of me that was covered by clothes. Sorry. It was my half-blackness that led to the difficulty of the assignment. I could write only one myth, which meant I would have to choose between a story from my mother and one from my father. If I elected to tell Mom's stories, it would have to be that of my great-great-grandfather Rufus, but where to begin? In 1862, when he was 6 years old, Rufus and his 2 brothers were taken from their home in Arkansas to work on a plantation in Texas. Rufus was unaware that, as he was entering captivity, the Civil War was raging around him. The family Rufus worked for saw no need to tell him when the end of the war finally came. He'd been a slave for 4 years when he overheard that the law had set him free. Shortly after making this discovery, he hid in the field until he was sure all of the inhabitants of the house were out of doors working. Snuck into the house to steal onions and a few scraps from the kitchen, and made a dash for it. Too old and feeble to chase a healthy, work-hardened 10-year-old, the master sent Red, a snarling family dog, after the boy. The master had forgotten that Rufus had raised Red from up top, and the 2 friends made their escape together. When he was 18, Rufus returned to Arkansas and found his mother and aunt still living there. He found his younger brother Billy by chance many, many years later at a traveling circus show. Isn't that perfect? Couldn't it be a page out of 1001 Arabian Nights? I'm not sure why I decided in the end not to share it. My best guess is that I was afraid Rufus's story was too complicated, that it had too many layers and would take too long to adapt for a grade 5 level laminated picture book. Part of me wonders, though, if I shied away from it because I felt it wasn't mine to claim, that Rufus, wanderer, adventurer, was too far away from my world, which was small and sheltered and darkish white. By grade 5, I was already awakening to the fact that my mother told one story and my skin another. Thank you.